Hello, I'm Donovan Bigelow, and this is the first in several lectures on the subject of sexuality. I'm going to be going through a text by Dr. David E. Scharf. It's called The Sexual Relationship, an Object Relations View of Sex and the Family. Now, I'm absolutely convinced that this is the most important single text on sexuality since Freud's 1905 three essays on the theory of sexuality. It's a remarkable work and runs very much counter to what I think are a lot of modern prejudices about what sexuality is and how it functions. I will apologize up front a little bit for probably reading too much. This text is so important that I want to get the key points exactly right. So bear with me. I will be reading selections from it, probably too much, but better to do that than miss something critical in what I think, again, is the most critical book written in a long time on the question of sexuality. Part of what this runs counter to is the modern sort of revolution in knowledge about sexuality and sexual research. The problem with most of it in the last almost 50 years has been its aggressive focus on purely the behavioral or mechanistic aspects of sexual interaction. And in our culture now, we have the misunderstanding that you have a sex life that is outside the context of who you are on a daily basis walking around. And that is just utterly and completely false and destructive in a way, and perhaps even symptomatic, that we do not want to recognize the truth that we are, in fact, our sexuality, that there is no separation between our sex life and our identity, that sexuality and identity are two sides of the same coin. This is tremendously disturbing for a lot of people. Makes it very easy to focus on the externals, the mechanics, the behavior, the quality of the orgasm, or any of the other externals that fill up the modern discussion of sexual interaction. You are your sex life. As if that wasn't disturbing enough. We have the very clear developmental psychology, the infant observation folks and child developmental researchers coming to the now, I don't believe, meaningfully questioned conclusion that if you are your sex life, it must begin at birth, possibly even before. I think Freud's most revolutionary, troubling, disruptive discovery was the central importance of sexual attraction and jealousy among parents and children, and the defense mechanisms that were evoked around those troubling experiences to contain the inevitable anxiety and fear around those intense feelings. Again, feelings that reflect an inevitable human development from birth. If that is true, and it seems unmistakably true to me now, it makes sense that we are so vulnerable, so anxious around any discussion of sexuality. You just have to use the phrase sexuality and people will titter, they will giggle, they will show manifestations, behavioral manifestations of anxiety. They make jokes, they make light, they deny, they turn away. I think that we and our modern liberal culture have taken the stance that we're so open, so available, so sexually liberated. But I find that to be entirely untrue, and that stance appears to be a defense against what remains, what will probably always remain the most dangerous subject, and that's sexuality, because it calls into question every element of our identity. The text by Dr. Scharf walks through a lifetime of sexual and relational development, from birth to death. And I think every chapter of the text evokes in us some difficulty. So I'm giving you this information as by way of warning a little bit, that this is going to be troubling material. And I hope you can contain your own anxiety, your own reactions, and listen to what Dr. Scharf has to say. And I guess that may be the best way to start this. If you can be aware that you're going to hear things that evoke in you a variety of reactions. And can you hold those reactions in a mindful way? When you hear something that that you disagree with, that you feel like is a personal insult or an assault on your sense of self or what you do or don't do? Is there a part of you that can sort of be what Freud called the observing ego and hold a place of not knowing, of letting it be unclear and let your mind work on it in a way that might allow you to move into a deeper place of knowing and not simply foreclose, not simply defend against disturbing information. That's my fantasy of how this stuff might be most useful to you. To begin with, Freud, in his discussion of the Oedipus complex and his discussion of childhood psychosexual development, and that was his phrase, psychosexual development, came to the revolutionary idea that sexual development and psychological, emotional, even physiological, neurological development are utterly integrated with each other. He came up initially with the developmental sequence, the oral, the anal, the phallic stages, latency, adolescence, and adulthood. He was the first to suggest that children don't just grow up, they need to be raised, that they go through very distinct developmental stages. And he consistently suggested that within those even very early stages, there was a budding element of sexuality that had to be addressed honestly. I think it's fair to say that in the entire relatively new field of developmental psychology, no one disagrees with Freud now. He has put his stamp on the field of developmental psychology to the point where no one disagrees that there are stages of development. That was his great revolution in that part of my field. They disagree about where the stages are, what to call them, when they start, when they stop, what the child must go through in order to successfully complete that stage and move on to the next. There is, probably always will be, endless discussion and innovation and people coming up with new names about new stages. But the idea of the stages, we can credit Freud and credit a rather astonishing breakthrough in thinking about development of the human. The other thing that's important to recognize is that because sexuality is so tied to identity, it is also subject to the same defense mechanisms that I've talked about in previous lectures, that it evokes in us both desire, longing, fear, anxiety. It almost inevitably evokes in us a need to split off dangerous parts of ourselves, feared parts of ourselves, feared parts of those others, our parents, which we have taken in. So that sexuality as an adult cannot meaningfully be distinguished from the accumulated experience of our developmental childhood. It also can't be distinguished in its particulars from the person's defensive array, from the way they manage anxiety. Because it turns out, if sexuality is so important to our identity, then it will inevitably evoke in us anxieties that have to be dealt with defensively. So those two sides of the coin have to be looked at pretty consistently. This is not the right place for a detailed description of the Oedipus complex, but I think it's fair to say that this is another one of Freud's revolutionary innovations in his understanding of what it means to be human. I think, again, briefly, in our modern culture, no one seems to understand what Freud was actually saying. We've simply reacted too aggressively. We've reacted with hostility. We've reacted defensively around the question of childhood psychosexual development. The idea that a boy or a girl child could have some kind of vague sexualized feeling states involving their parents strikes many people as offensive, as sinful, as horrible, and they cannot think about it. I think in part that happens because they exaggerate what Freud was saying in order to avoid addressing the context and content of his actual meaning. So we get people misunderstanding Freud in, I think, a motivated way. Freud never interpreted a child's response as anything like adult sexuality. Infants, toddlers, young children do not think of having overt penile vaginal intercourse with their parents in the classical sense. That's absurd. Of course, they don't have the cognitive functioning, they don't have memory, they don't have the learning skills, they don't have the neurological sophistication to even begin to think in those overt, concrete adult terms of sexuality. Okay, so what's going on? There's a budding awareness in the infant. Freud said at about 3.5 years. Melanie Klein backed it up to somewhere in the neighborhood of even 6 months. There's some budding awareness that the mother and father are in a connection that excludes the child. This is the jealousy that we talked about before. And what does the child imagine? The child imagines interrupting that connection to keep for him or herself what has been up to that point, the fantasy of a symbiotic oneness with the mother. If the father is intervening, the boy finds himself jealous of the father and wishing to replace. If the girl sees that happening, she inevitably wants what mother is getting that she is being denied. This is all very primitive fantasies of feeling states that do not have a concrete manifestation in the children's minds. So how that develops, how the parents contain those early feelings, will determine the psychosexual development of the young child, adolescent, and adult. Freud probably was right again on characterizing the Oedipus complex as the nuclear complex, the developmental dynamic, if you will, that is central to the child's adolescent and adult functioning in any kind of a healthy way at all. And it isn't surprising that it goes back to fundamental issues of sexuality. It seems, if you look around, that Freud was also right, that sexuality in its broadest forms drives virtually all human behavior, both individually and in terms of group dynamics. Now I will have lectures later on group psychology, social psychology, group dynamics. Suffice now to say that at the core of even that seemingly attenuated collections of human behaviors, we will find inevitably a powerful sexual component to them all. There have been lots of studies on sexuality, of course. It has not escaped any psychologist's attention that at some level sexuality is critically important to their work with individual patients. But in addition, researchers have been fascinated by the subject. Dr. Scharf's approach, though fundamentally object relational, does attempt to integrate child development research, attachment theory research, a great deal of the overt, objective, scientific research involving the physical manifestations of sexuality, the Kinsey and Masters and Johnson and Kaplan approaches. So, with that, let us move to Chapter 1, Introduction. For a couple, what does sexuality do? And right off the bat, Dr. Scharf suggests that, that sexuality represents a physical aspect of the couple's integration. It draws on the unconscious developmental dynamics in each person and allows a physical connection that also involves an intimate and personal emotional connection between the two people. And perhaps as important as that is the connection between those two people and their unconscious developmental patterns, what Scharf calls the object relational development of the individuals. There is inevitably an unconscious resonance between two people in a sexually intimate relationship. There is an unconscious resonance between their entire developmental history. We do not get attracted to a potential sexual intimate partner randomly, casually, or because of cultural norming. We recognize consciously something attractive about them, but Scharf suggests that a central component to any sexual intimacy is the reverberation, the intuition, the resonance, I think that may be the best word, between the couple's unconscious developmental accumulated experience. We resonate with a potential sexual partner much before we are in any conscious way aware of the details of why we think they're attractive. The work that involves a healthy, intimate relationship, and here's the good news, provides an opportunity to rework some of those perhaps damaged, some of those perhaps inadequately developed elements of our own identity. We have a chance in sexuality to heal some of our own individual developmental wounds. A symbolic opportunity to repair faults and to continue and even strengthen those good and strong and healthy elements of us. In addition, there is no doubt now, it seems, that a sexual life of parents is the center around which their relationship rotates, but it also becomes, inevitably, the center of the family dynamic. The atmosphere, the loving, the intimate, the respectful sharing of physical intimacies between the parents pervades the household dynamic, is the atmosphere within which the children are raised, and is directly, we think now, taken in by those children and forms the bedrock of their budding sexual experience, will be the bedrock for their adolescent and adult sexual functioning themselves. If it is that important for good development, it has the potential, therefore, to be derailed. And that's the great advantage, the great opportunity of sexual development. It is also, for the same reasons, the great danger. If the psychosexuality goes wrong, if sexuality becomes too defended against, if it becomes associated with too much anxiety, fears of abandonment, aggression, then it can derail all the relationships in a family. As Dr. Scharf says, both the richness and the vulnerability have to be addressed. I think I should say a little bit about science. Science can shine a great deal of light on every field of psychology, but there's much it cannot shine on, and sexuality seems to be one of those ideas where science and research are of limited utility. The problem with that is that we are not going to be able to get at some objective scientific truth. The study of sexuality will not likely ever be the scientific equivalent of physics, mathematics, biology, or chemistry. There is so much in the unconscious that is not amenable to scientific research that we are left with the clinical research of child development specialists and sexual researchers and psychoanalytic therapists and psychoanalysts. What that means is what I'm presenting to you is not a claim to truth. This is a claim to usefulness, perhaps a claim to truth with a small t, but it remains tentative. It remains open to new experience, new research, new clinical evidence. This is not a dogmatic statement of the truth as Dr. Scharf sees it or claims it to be in any objective way at all. Now, having said that, there is profound reliance on clinical data that if you disagree with these findings, the burden is on you to prove where and how they are wrong. That you don't like them is not proof of their lack of validity. To the extent they remain useful, they will remain, I believe, the center of thinking around sexuality and sexual development for potentially decades to come. So, a little bit of humble acceptance of the limitations, but also a reinforcement that we may not rely on the hardcore science methodology to come to our conclusions, but there is something remarkably useful, remarkably valid in 100 years of clinical experience and the experience of working with patients with these difficulties. So I'll leave it at that. Perhaps the final comment in the introduction, the final bit of understanding, modern understanding, that may run counter to what most people think about this. I want to reiterate the idea of accumulation, that your sex life isn't something that you achieve in mid to late adolescence. It isn't something that you do. You have from birth, and probably in utero, begun the accumulation of your minute-to-minute, moment-to-moment experiences with your parents, those who nurtured you, those who raised you, and those internalizations, which involve physical care, emotional care, involve an atmosphere in the home you were raised in, involved inevitably the internalization of the parents' sexual dynamics. All of that is what is in each subsequent developmental stage built upon your sex life, if we want to use that archaic phrase, must inevitably be seen as not something independent, but the end result of a lifetime of accumulated experience. And not even the end result, a way station, where you are now. In the conclusion of Dr. Scharf's book, he's very clear, and I agree with this, that there is no end point where you have achieved your final mature sexuality. That sexuality is a dynamic, accumulating, growing, developing central part of your identity, and there's nothing in my field that suggests that should ever stop developing. You stop developing when you die. Until then, the next day is the next struggle. And so I want to make sure that a central understanding in the introduction to the Scharf material is an awareness that this is a dynamic field. The other criticism of the idea of a sex life is that it appears in that definition to be static. It is what it is. And Dr. Scharf's, one of his great insights is no, that it is what it is now because of the accumulation of prior experience. And if there is a way to incorporate more healthy experiences, take in more loving connection between the partners, take in more introject, identify with, take in, however you want to describe the experience of a mind building and growing, that you never need be satisfied and feel like you're done in the area of personal development or in the area of emotional, sexual development. Okay, so let's move on to chapter 2, the sexual relationship. First, a quote from Freud. There are thus good reasons why a child sucking at his mother's breast has become the prototype of every relation of love. The finding of an object is in fact the refinding of it. This is profound. We do not become attracted to someone because of the present value judgments in our lives. We become attracted to someone because they recreate in us that first intimate object relational dynamic between the child and the mother. That idea that we do not find love, we re-find it seems like the doorway into which this discussion can be had. Because I think most people have some intuitive awareness, some visceral sense of understanding that the mate they picked wasn't picked randomly, wasn't picked because of Madison Avenue advertising about what beauty is in men or women, that it really did reflect something fundamental, that they were drawn to this person, not a different one, that they were pulled to them, that there were emotional ties to that person that felt almost inexorable. We get quickly into the definition and meaning, both scientifically and poetical, of love. And Freud lays down potentially a way to think about it as so primary, so fundamental, because it really is the core of our very first experience of love in the arms of our mother, that the suckling at the breast becomes the prototype. And I think that's profound. It also suggests an interesting way of thinking about adult love relationships at the physical level. Well, of course it's at the physical level. How else could it be? And the answer is, of course, at an unconscious emotional level. And both of those things are correct. They're not exclusive. It's not one or the other. Sexuality at an emotional level, which doesn't have a physical component, seems hollow. Sexuality that is merely a physical exercise is pointless or damaging or inadequate at the very least. So there is a physiological and physical component to the emotional connection. And isn't it astonishing how direct the connection is between the mother's handling the physiological rhythmic movements of the child care and the adult interaction of a sexual nature? It seems rather astonishing. We both, children and adults, relate through the body. And there is a great deal of neurological research these days, an astonishing amount actually, that unmistakably connects the physiological connection and the emotional connection of a mother and child, both of those things together, as the necessary precursors to neurological growth. Love, intimacy, a psychosexual intimacy between the mother and the child makes your brain grow. There's no longer any separating physiology, neurological structures from development, relating, and child rearing techniques. They are inextricably interwoven together. That literally the neurological structure of the brain is what it is because of the developmental patterns of nurturing care laid down between the mother and the baby. It's an astonishing modern revolution in neurological research, and amazingly supports Freud's conclusion of 110 years ago, before he had any inkling of the kind of neurological research technologies that we now have available to us. Another way of thinking about this is also what I think now is an almost common sense understanding. We all know this, that there is a special poignancy lacking in any human connection that doesn't involve the body. I've said for years that if you remember back to your adolescence, which for some of you was a while ago and for some not so much, the first time you were walking with a potential boyfriend or girlfriend and you reached over to hold hands, there was a spark there. There was an intensity that everything changed. It's impossible to imagine that you listening to this do not remember your first kiss. That first connection at the body level has a level of intensity to it that has to be paid attention to. I think this quote makes sense, bottom of page 5. And in adulthood, some of the most profound and earliest hopes and fears, loves and disappointments, are awakened by bodily experience or by its frustration. Because of the tangible reenactment of the past, this interlocking force of physical and psychological urges in adult physical intimacy is as powerful as anything in the realm of human relationships. I think that's simply true. To move now back to the infant and the development of psychosexuality. The individual's growth is so completely dependent on the context of mother and family that it cannot be understood without reference to them. I think that's a way to reiterate in a different technical way what I just said. Children don't grow up. They have to be raised. And their development, literally the physical structure of their brains, and every element of their identity at an emotional and subsequently cognitive level will depend virtually entirely on the presence of a loving, containing mother figure. Sexual development unfolds as a series of biological events which both trigger and form the context for psychological growth. And the underlying template here is the integration of physiological and emotional containment and care. We pass through stages. That seems to be clear and virtually universally recognized now. However, when it comes to the sexuality portion of this, they seem not just to proceed sequentially, they seem to condense, they seem to interweave in this complex dance. There's one conflict superimposed on another, one internalized relationship fused with another. and all of them expressed in a very simplified, embodied sexual way. That's the complexity of it. In late adolescence and adulthood, your entire accumulated experience, the entire moment by moment accumulation of your life experience and its core sexual component gets manifested in a relatively simple way, in a simple physical, sexual way. And Dr. Scharf suggests that this is one of those moments where you have a moment of clarity. It either feels good or it doesn't. And if it does because you've accumulated enough healthy, loving containment that your emotional, object relational structures within you are stable and strong and enduring, then it's a wonderful thing. And sexuality will be then a wonderful capstone to a couple's individual healthy relationship, and a capstone and a great joy between them that fosters further growth and development of themselves and their family. Where it does not feel good, then we have the opportunity to repair. Then we have also the great danger that a very many great things have gone wrong, and relationships become at risk. Identity becomes at risk. A little sexual problem might be a little sexual problem, but it also might be the tip of the iceberg. When a patient comes into therapy and casually mentions some mild frustration around the question of sexuality, though in the context of several other things, it's incumbent on competent therapists to pay attention to that, because there is no such thing as a simple or minor sexual problem. At least we shouldn't assume so up front. A fourth or fifth complication here is that how your sex life manifests itself will inevitably be a combination of your actual physical connection and the unconscious and perhaps conscious fantasy life, desire, the accumulated experience and your memory of other fantasized, experienced sexual experiences or interactions. When it's good, it's very, very good. And when it goes wrong, it can represent the potential destruction of a life. I had a patient not long ago who was the victim of some fairly serious emotional neglect in childhood. Not a lot of overt abuse, physical or sexual, but he was quite frankly used by a narcissistic mother and a fairly absent, distant father. How that translated for him was that his sexuality became quite masochistic, that he was trained in childhood that his relationship to his mother, which was all he had because his father was absent, which reinforced the poignancy and intensity and necessity of that relationship, could only be maintained if he sacrificed himself, if he never made any demands on his mother, if he always complied with her needs. To that extent, and only to that extent, could he feel safe in this continuing connection, pathological as it was. How did that translate into his adult sexuality? Well, he ended up in relationships quite frequently that were quite masochistic. Not a big surprise that he would sacrifice himself. But of course, it became dysfunctional. It wouldn't work. There wasn't a healthy and mutual interchange. And so the sexuality itself became quite sadomasochistic. He would, as often as not, simply withdraw because the relational dynamic, the sexual dynamic became so drenched in the childhood re-evocation of this terrible anxiety that he was left with resorting to masturbation as his virtually only non-damaging sexual outlet. And yet it was damaging because it denied him an intimacy that he desperately needed. It was a very sad case, but I think poignantly connected, in my mind, early psychosexual development with adult sexuality. The symbolic function of sex is a subject Dr. Scharf comes back to over and over. He describes it as a linkage, that there's a link, all right? Sex is partly a physical interaction in the real world, But when it expresses the aliveness of the emotional link between two people, it is also a sign of the link between each person and his internal objects. And this is, I think, the good part of it, can be, that there is a link, that we are not just engaging in a physical act, that it evokes between two people an emotional connection. And I think it ought to seem obvious to most people that there is an intense emotional connection as well as a physical one in anything remotely approaching a healthy sexual interaction. Part of what that means is that a successful link between the person physically and emotionally calls up the good internal object, calls up the accumulated experiences of love and contentment and joy, both physical and emotional. It calls up the possibility of repairing those elements in our lives that weren't healthy, that we continue to have accumulated in our day-to-day experience. If those are the good potential elements for a healthy sexual interaction, then, like my patient, a failure of sexuality, a failure of that emotional linkage can evoke likewise terrible anxieties, great fears and great pains, catastrophic feelings of abandonment, which I think are below the surface in most of us at some level. Sexuality can symbolize the memory of the good and loving parent, not the conscious memory of an actual embodied parent, but the unconscious memory, the earlier childhood experience of an object that takes in, is safe, contains, is loving, can be trusted. Okay? It also provides an opportunity, because no parents are ever perfect. There always are elements of the child's developmental experience which take in a punitive object, a withholding object. A healthy sexuality now achieved can be the bridge between an opportunity to repair that withholding object that is now within us. The possibility of tolerating the bad object, the possibility of, in fact, healing the bad object, the possibility of forgiving, consciously or unconsciously, those things which were done to us that damaged us. If that can be done internally, then you have a potential bridge to those very dynamics with the other person emotionally. And vice versa, the beauty of a healthy sexual intimacy with a healthy, contained, adult, mature emotional capacity between the two is itself can generate the kind of healing dynamic between the two adults that can make them share with each other healthier interactions which are part of the ongoing developmental experience. To be able to synthesize and repair and to continue the healthy development seems to be an astonishing opportunity in a healthy sex life. It puts a great burden on sexuality potentially, but I think if it's true, or to the extent it's true, that sexuality is in fact part of our identity, then the burden is on us, and it's inescapable to some degree. If we know that, if we accept that profound insight, then we have the door open to healing and repair and maturing in a very direct way indeed. I want to add a critical point about the meaning of a good sex life. I think, again, because our so-called modern approach to sexuality, which has been so overblown in movies, TV, media, I heard a statistic the other day, I don't know if it's true, that a third of the entire internet is dedicated to pornography. This is a nightmare, that we are inundated on a daily basis by overt sexualized images that seem to be, because they're marketing some product most of the time, giving us the fantasy that if just we do this, or just if we have that, then this is the kind of partner, and the implication is often quite direct, that this is the ecstatic sexuality we can achieve, this over-the-top idealization of orgiastic ecstasy. This is absurd. This is ridiculous. It's destructive as hell in some direct ways, I think. What Dr. Scharf is struggling toward, at best, is a variation on a theme by Winnicott. The good enough mother was an idea that Winnicott laid down that I think is very healthy, and I've covered it in the previous lectures on child development. Scharf takes it to the next level with the idea of good enough sex. Similar to the good enough mother, you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be a porn star. You don't have to have the sort of performances that we see now depicted as if they're normal when they are, first of all, absurd, and to struggle after them seems a symptom of pathology most of the time. Good enough sex remains a very high standard. A good sex life ought to occasionally be all you need and all you want, occasionally should meet most of the fundamental needs of both partners. On an ongoing basis, that's not too much to ask, but it cannot be perfect, and it cannot be fantasized as world historical and some sort of delusional ideal. It represents, in a way, an achievement of a reality-based functioning, what Klein called the depressive position. It's a bad choice of language. It's not suggesting a pathology, but suggesting the integration, a wholeness, the ability to see others as a whole object, to be seen as others by a whole object. And by that, it doesn't mean a perfect object. That we come as whole objects with an awareness of our partner's failures, with an awareness of our failures, our occasional missteps, our occasional overreactions. The ideal, I've heard this for quite some time, the ideal, if there's an ideal in a good enough partner, in a good enough sex life, then at best it's seeing a partner's foibles and errors as part of their charm. We don't berate them, we don't consider them a disaster, we don't feel threatened with abandonment when our partner fails us. We know we'll fail them, and we can accept that from a place of mature strength. Good enough sexuality ought to entail that kind of emotional maturity. The next big issue, page 11. The sex life of the parents is therefore closely related to the adequacy of the nurturing environment given to the child and adolescent. The ways in which this is true are often startlingly direct. I think that what I'm about to explain, if you got that sentence or two, I think this is one of the most disturbing things about this lecture on sexuality and the subsequent ones. This is a reality that is so hard for parents to tolerate that it almost at this point shuts down their ability to think about the subject of sexuality. Here's the idea that you can't be a good parent unless you have a good sex life. What does that really mean? I think it means exactly what it says, that unless two people have achieved the depressive position, have achieved an integrity, a wholeness, a maturity, a good enough sex life between them, then they're not going to be able to provide the children with an emotional environment in the home that will result in the children's healthy emotional development. It seems obvious when you begin studying an object relational approach to adult sexuality, but this is one of those points that feels dangerous, because who of us believes we have a really, really good sex life, and our children are sort of in a secondary way bathed in the glory of our relationship with our spouses? I mean, it's a rare couple indeed that feel like they can say that. So what I'm saying is inevitably threatening. It's a challenge. It might be perceived as an accusation. If you don't have a good sex life, you're a bad parent. And there are some cases where that is the inescapable conclusion. But it need not be the inescapable conclusion. We may be able to escape from it. That if you get that sexuality and identity are two sides of the same coin, if you get that development is ongoing and that repair is a possibility, then you can improve, develop, get better, help the children heal the inevitable mistakes that parents make that need not result in any kind of childhood or adolescent pathology or subsequently adult pathology. How about if we think of this material as an opportunity instead of an accusation? What is it about your sex life that you are dissatisfied with? Can you use this material to recognize how it is that it became that way? What it means in terms of your identity and character? What it means in terms of the end result of an accumulation of your personal psychosexual development from birth and on? If you see it in that way, it is then an opportunity to enrich your lives and those of your children as quickly as reasonably possible. Continuing in that vein, if there are what Scharf calls a sexual disjunction, and it's a technical word he uses here, and I think it's apropos. I think it makes sense. In the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the category of sexual dysfunctions, associated sometimes sort of divided up between dysfunction and perversion, the more serious dysfunctions. The word dysfunction is now sort of in our culture. It's in the Diagnostic Manual. It's been given the imprimatur of science in some ways. It's when sexuality goes, for an individual, goes very, very wrong in a variety of ways. That will be an entire subsequent lecture, how that happens and what it means. Scharf is not talking about anything that pathological, that damaging, that derailed. He's talking about relationships that seem to be mostly together, but something has gone wrong a little bit. He calls it not a dysfunction, but a disjunction. What happens at a junction? You go one or the other way. Scharf's idea of relationships as central to our identity and to our sexuality suggests with that word that we have simply parted company a little bit here. And the hope is that we can redirect our emotions, our growth, and our connections in a more, in a healthier way. So that any sexual dysfunction, psychically, becomes understood as a dysfunction or a disjunction of personal emotional connectedness. That sexuality, and this may be one of the central philosophical foundations that perhaps I should have been more clear about to begin with, but that Freud believed that sexuality was the unfolding, the unveiling, the developmental derivatives of drives, of sexual and aggressive, biologically based drives, and its unveiling or unfolding in development. Scharf disagrees with that. He does not simply see biology as driving the train here, though I think in behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology, sociobiology, all those other biologically based fields of study, everyone agrees that biology is the bedrock. We are fundamentally biological creatures. But I think the more sophisticated way of understanding sexuality is that though biologically based, it becomes primarily a function of intimate human relationships, both alive in the here and now and internalized and made unconscious in our object relational or psychic reality. That's the key difference between Scharf and Freud, the idea that sexuality takes place in our minds in a psychic reality primarily unconscious and primarily composed of the internalized objects of our childhood, primarily our parents. That's what object means. It just means person. It means mother and father 99 times out of 100. And if there is a sexual symptom, something that's unsatisfying about your sex life, then its repair, its development requires an evaluation of those intimate developmental relational bonds. So let's move to chapter 3, the relevance of infancy for sexuality, the child's attachment to its mother. Heinz Lichtenstein was a great psychoanalyst. He wrote a foundational text almost as important as this one called Identity and Sexuality. It's where I think Dr. Scharf gets some of his material. It's certainly where I've gotten some of mine. The quote is, "In the primitive sensory exchanges taking place between mother and infant, one could see the precursor of adult sexuality." Sounds a lot like Freud here, but I think he puts a slightly different spin on it. In the primitive sensory exchanges taking place between mother and infant, the way the child relates to the mother, the way the mother relates to the child, the feeling states, the bodily movements, those quite literally and directly, one can see subsequent adult sexual behavior as a development of those early physiological and emotional bonds. It is also unmistakable that it is, again, those bonds that form the atmosphere within which children are raised in the family. Dr. Scharf summarizes some of the best research in child development, and the conclusion is unmistakable. A child's life depends on having a mother. Now that seems obvious, but what he's suggesting is broader and deeper, that a child's mind, literal survival, physiologically as well as developmental growth emotionally, depends on having a containing, healthy, loving, present mother. Without that, developmental derailment happens very quickly. And it isn't just the presence of a physical mother, that this has an emotional component, that the mother has to be healthy. The mother has to be whole, contained, has to herself get her needs met adequately, herself be contained in a loving relationship of some kind, in order to provide that child with the relational dynamic it needs to internalize a healthy sense of itself. One of the most shocking studies that Scharf walks us through is the comparison in the psychological and emotional functioning of infants who had been put in two different places. Some infants put in orphanages where their physiological needs were very well taken care of, but they were passed among caregivers, as is often inevitable in orphanages. Subsequently, those children's emotional lives were evaluated, and they were compared with the emotional lives of babies raised in prisons with their mothers who were convicted and sentenced to prison while they were pregnant and were effectively raised in a prisoned environment for the first year or two of their lives. And what they found was an unmistakable conclusion, that the data was unmistakable, that the children raised in prison with their own mothers were significantly better off emotionally, significantly developmentally better off than the children raised in orphanages with multiple caregivers. The take-home lesson here is unmistakable. A single, present, healthy mother is what's the ideal environment for a child's physical, emotional, and physiological, even neuronal growth. A neurological researcher a couple of years ago took a brain scan, MRIs, functional MRIs, I think, of neglected babies and babies raised in a normal environment, in a healthy environment where their needs were mostly met. And what was discovered was utterly shocking, is that the physiology of the brains of the neglected babies was dramatically underdeveloped, that the number of brain cells and the sophistication of the interconnections between those brain cells was dramatically, you could see the scans themselves were obvious, that the neurological development of the child depended as much on love, as much on a nurturing emotional environment as on anything directly genetic or physiological. Astonishing research, actually. Perhaps the biggest area of research, child research, is in the field of attachment. And the connection here between these two fields, I think, is very direct. Everyone seems to get now that attachment, the way a baby connects to the mother, is not primarily around the acquisition of food for the baby, though of course that's a significant component. It appears now that there's enough clinical evidence to suggest that it is the relationship to the mother, the connection, the emotional interaction and connection to the baby and between the baby and the mother that really sets the stage for the child's ability to be in relationships later. The attachment is about an emotional connection. The Harry Harlow monkey experiments from the 60s, which are available online, and I've seen them, they're quite disturbing actually, gives ethological evidence of the kind of connection we're talking about here. Now, we can't extrapolate too far between animal experiments and humans, I get that, but the experiments are so poignant. They raised baby monkeys without a mother and gave a baby monkey a choice between a cloth-covered wire representation of a mother monkey and a hard wire representation that had a bottle and nipple on it. And the monkey would go to the nipple for feeding and then immediately stay with the cloth soft-covered mother monkey in what seemed obvious to the researchers, at least, to represent an emotional need, a need for soothing, for care, for containment, that was more important to the monkey than the feeding opportunity. The conclusions, or the tentative conclusions, the suggestions those researchers left us with was that, and I think as well, the better part of 80 years of child developmental research directly from clinicians who do infant observation and child developmental observations, is that children who are neglected themselves have a very difficult time becoming connected to others in healthy relationships in terms of their adolescent development, but also in terms of their partnering, also in terms of their ability to be parents themselves. So the quote here again from Lichtenstein: "In the primitive sensory exchanges taking place between mother and infant, one could see the precursors of adult sexuality. The primitive modalities of stimulation occurring between mother and infant in the earliest phases of life are a primitive pregenital form of adult sexuality." And if that connection is healthy and loving and nurturing, the bedrock is laid for healthy adult sexuality. You do not learn about sexuality in late adolescence. You do not become sexual in late adolescence and early adulthood. 90% of your sexual experience has already been laid down long before you hit puberty. If that can be understood, then there's a much higher possibility of sexual disjunctions being healed in a way that preserves the relationship, preserves the marriage, preserves the atmosphere in a healthy way for the children. One more element that Scharf discusses concerning a way to think about child development in this way, a developmental line of gaze interaction. There's a whole body of research about children and the way they come to look at their mothers and the way the mothers look at them. One of the discoveries that seems sort of interesting was that the way a mother and a baby play with each other, the way a baby flirts with the mother, tries to attract the mother's attention, the facial expressions, the lip movements, some of even the noises, are amazingly similar, if not identical, to the kind of thing observed between adolescents who are courting each other. Obviously they're different, but it doesn't seem surprising, given this line of research, that those connections seem obvious if you're looking for them, at the very least. The last bit I want to talk about in this section is, again, a reflection of Winnicott's idea of true and false self. After he wrote the Good Enough Mother theory, he, I think, developed this idea of the true and false self. And I think this is a simple, non-theoretical way of understanding child development and adult functioning, that when the baby responds to the mother, if the mother responds to the baby appropriately, fosters, facilitates the baby's true self, facilitates the flourishing of the baby's little aliveness. It's the best way I've found to describe it. Then the baby will grow, that true self will grow and become a healthy individual. If the mother isn't healthy, if the atmosphere in the home isn't healthy, then the child is impinged on, then the child is forced effectively out of fear of abandonment, which is the worst possible fear for a baby or an infant or a child. The child is forced to comply with the parental demands. The child's own needs are displaced away from its survival needs, which means it has to keep the mother happy. It has to try its little best to meet the mother's needs in cases of depression or narcissism or any of a dozen other possible derailments of the mother. So the question here becomes, how do you give what you haven't gotten? And I think this is where therapy comes in. If a mother hasn't herself, in the context of her own mother's mothering of her, and fathering for that matter, hasn't gotten a true self, a joyous, whole, integrated self that can provide that flourishing atmosphere for the baby's growing aliveness. If she doesn't get that, how could she give it? And that's where therapy comes in, because if the identity and the sexuality of a person is the accumulation of experience, then there's no reason that it's ever foreclosed. Then there's hope. Then there's an opportunity to intervene and re-facilitate a developmental trajectory that allows the flourishing of the mother so that she can facilitate the flourishing of the child. This is, again, one of the bits of research, a text called Ghosts in the Nursery, where they realized that until or unless a mother could get her wounded identity, her sexual derailment that she experienced in the neglectful or derailed treatment she experienced in her house, she could not provide the bedrock healthy atmosphere for her own baby. Heal that and then give that, and then the mother has the ability to give it to the child. I think that also makes sense in the context of a couple of my patients. I have a patient now who's in his late 40s, and a very depressed, weak father, a very narcissistic, aggressive mother, and a sexual relationship between them that seemed to be more aggressive than sexual. That's what he took in. Not a healthy, good self flourishing in his own aliveness, almost had very little of that. So that his sexuality was the result not just of what he was taught, but his reaction against it. To him, watching his parents, sexuality was a hostile, aggressive, dangerous thing. That was the atmosphere in the home that he took in. So he didn't want that, so he swung to the other extreme and ended up in relationships with adult women where he was so passive because he had such fear of his natural, instinctive, masculine aggression that he just assumed it would be poisonously dangerous, both for his partners and for himself, that he repressed all that and became quite effeminate, quite passive, which of course didn't function very well in his sexual relationships and was the source of a great deal of pain between them. And most importantly, he's come through the therapy where he has internalized, I think, or has allowed to flourish some of his own repressed, long repressed masculine dynamics, that he can see now that aggression uncontained is bad, but denied is also bad. And he is now, with his own son and daughter, allowing himself to experience a healthy type of aggression, which is providing his own children now with both a healthier internalized aggression, and I think with his partner now is experiencing a type of sexuality which is much richer, and the secondary gain in the children is, I think, obvious to everyone in the family. Let's take a break at the end of this section, and we'll begin with chapter 4 next hour. Thank you very much.